So welcome everybody to the first and only plenary panel for today, the Aloha Day of the Acquisition Research Symposium. And pleasantly enough, the conversation today is on acquisition research. What is the future of acquisition research? And for that, we've brought together three distinguished participants, leaders in the acquisition research community. Dr. Keith Snider, NPS, a prior program integrator for acquisition research here at NPS. Dr. Arun Seraphin of the SASC professional staff, who has been active in recent legislation on acquisition research. And then Dr. Dinesh Verma, Executive Director of the SERC, and now the Executive Director for the Acquisition Innovation Research Center. So, and they'll speak in that order. Dr. Snider to discuss the history behind acquisition research at NPS. Dr. Seraphin to talk about the legislative history and Congress's view on acquisition research. And then Dr. Verma to talk about the department's response to that legislation and what he sees as the future of acquisition research in the Department of Defense. So that's the battering order today. My intent is to introduce each speaker. They have about 20 minutes each to talk, say what they've got to say, and then I'll move on to the next, and then we'll take questions at the end. For audience participants, please use the Q&A tab to ask your question. I will moderate those questions. If you see somebody else's questions you like, you get an opportunity to upvote it. That'll help me decide which questions should get asked. The more you get upvoted, the higher probability your question is going to get asked. And I will moderate those questions. If you can direct them to a particular speaker, please do that. If not, I'll open it to the group, or I'll pick who gets first cut at the answer, and the others can jump in. So that's the rule set. And with that, I'll start off with Dr. Snider. He is the Dean of the Graduate School of Defense Management here at the Naval Postgraduate School, a West Pointer, an NPS alumni, got his doctorate from Virginia Tech. Been here long. He got his degree here at postgraduate school several years before I showed up. So I thought I was sort of long in the tooth. He's got me beat by a lot. A very distinguished history or background in public policy. And as I mentioned, he was, I think not the first, but the second program integrator for ARP for several years. He's my boss's boss, and continues to keep an active hand in the business. So with that, over to you, Dr. Snider.
Thanks, Admiral Lewis, and good morning, everyone. Are you able to see my slides?
Not yet.
There we go.
There we go. You got it. Just make it full screen.
Okay, good. Good morning, everyone. So my task this morning is to give some historical perspectives on acquisition research, and I suppose I was asked to do this, first of all, because I'm old, and secondly, because I was, as Admiral Lewis said, PI for the acquisition research program from about 2003 through 2018. And so I've seen it progress over the years, and certainly not due to my own efforts, but those of really its founder, Dr. Dave Lamb, who is a true giant of an intellect in acquisition research. Also Admiral Jim Green, Kerry Schaefer, and now Admiral Lewis and Dr. Mortlock. I'd like to begin by noting that the acquisition research program at Naval Postgraduate School today is not, is unique. There's nothing else like it going on, but it's not unprecedented. Over the past half century, the Department of Defense has undertaken numerous research initiatives to address what we know are the seemingly perennial problems, especially with major weapon systems acquisition, cost overruns, schedule delays, performance shortfalls. And this just shows where some of those research efforts took place throughout roughly the decade of the 1970s. Most of these were fairly short-lived programs, and to judge from program outcomes, it's questionable about whether they had their desired effect on, again, on program outcomes. And during these same years, several authors commented on the state of acquisition research, and they acknowledged the potential for scholarly research in universities, in particular, to contribute to solutions. So much of my remarks this morning will focus on the issue of engaging university faculty in acquisition research. I should note the one reference at the bottom there, Strayer and Lockwood, 1976. Those were two gentlemen from the Congressional Research Service, and their paper was presented at the 5th Annual DoD Procurement Research Symposium at the Naval Postgraduate School. So over 45 years or so ago, this was the 5th Annual DoD Procurement Symposium that was going on. And so again, this is acquisition research is nothing new. We've been pursuing it for a while. But going back to university research, in thinking about the motivations and incentives for university faculty to become interested in defense acquisition, we can think primarily of funding opportunities and publication opportunities. And in this slide, I mentioned a couple of the attempts that were ultimately unsuccessful to generate interest through funding and publications. The first one was sponsored by then Undersecretary Gansler when he was in office to essentially establish a sponsored program for university research. You can see that 15 contracts were awarded. It terminated for budgetary reasons, and obviously also because Jack left office for a while, or after that time. Also, there are, in terms of publication outlets, there are very few scholarly outlets that focus specifically on acquisition. Now, Defense Acquisition University, since 1996, has published a referee journal, the Acquisition Review Quarterly, which is now the Defense Acquisition Review Journal. And before that, I think the Defense Systems Management College at Fort Belvoir was publishing a journal called the Defense Management Journal throughout the 1970s and possibly before that as well. And so, considering the public publish or perish incentives faced by university scholars, this sort of dearth of acquisition publication outlets indicates that there's not a whole lot of university scholars doing this sort of work. Now, in the late 1990s, some of the faculty members at NPS, I was one of those, issued a call for papers for a special issue of the Acquisition Review Quarterly, then published by DAU. And the call targeted scholars in universities and other research institutions specifically to engage their interest in acquisition as a primary area of research. The response to the call, though, was underwhelming, to say the least. We were able to generate only one of the 7 accepted articles for that special issue, and the remaining 6 articles we had to go out and personally solicit contributions from our colleagues at various universities. About 10 years ago, the same group of NPS faculty members again attempted to organize a special journal issue on defense acquisition, this time through the Journal of Public Procurement, which is published by Florida Atlantic University and the National Institute of Government Purchasing. Again, the results were disappointing. We received only 6 manuscripts in response to this call, and only 2 of them, after peer review, were judged to be acceptable for publication. That's not enough for a standalone special issue. So those papers just appeared in the regular issue of JOPP. Also, IJDAM, the International Journal of Defense Acquisition Management, a joint effort between Cranfield and NPS, was operating briefly between 2008-2014, always faced with the challenge of sufficient submissions to publish editions. So they ended their operations in 2014. So to summarize, very difficult to engage when you think of the brain power in among faculty at universities on acquisition research. Now, just some possible reasons for this. We know acquisitions a highly interdisciplinary enterprise effort activity, and it really is not owned by any one discipline. Multiple reference disciplines contribute to acquisition knowledge. There's really no single acquisition discipline with sort of a theory, underlying theory of acquisition. There's also no civilian university that has strictly defense acquisition concentrations. Few university faculty have interest in defense acquisition, relatively few, and we all know that academics beget future academics. We've alluded briefly to the lack of incentives for academics at other universities, few outlets for publications, few funding sources. There's also the issue of data, obtaining data from Department of Defense, the services to conduct research. I have heard one university academic, one of my colleagues, mention that researchers are attracted to good data like moths to flame. So if data are available, researchers will come. The bullet here about acquisition as a public sector function, I think, speaks to the lack of engagement by many of the business disciplines. Acquisition, as we know, has a significant aspect of politics to it. And so that tends to separate research and acquisition from those faculty who are in business schools or management schools throughout the nation. That might seem to drive acquisition more towards a discipline to be engaged by the public administration, public management, public policy faculty, but that also is a little bit problematic because it appears that there are several scholars who have mentioned this. Acquisition really is seen as a military activity. The locus, where acquisition takes place, the management of acquisition typically is within the military services. Most of that happens within the services. Certainly there's a lot that happens within the defense agencies and oversight by OSD as well. But we know that most of the key positions in defense acquisition are held by military officers. The vast preponderance of the acquisition workforce is civilian, but most of the PMs, PEOs, systems commanders are indeed military officers. So for a variety of reasons, most of the research needs have been met by the FFRDCs, nonprofits, and DAU, as well as some others. So turn now to the acquisition research program at the Naval Postgraduate School. This gives some information on the birth of ARP at NPS. And again, I would cite Dr. Dave Lamb as really the godfather of the program, who really got it all started with his efforts to bring on Jim Breen as the first chair, Kerry Schaefer as the first PM. And when he retired in 2003, December 2003, he turned to me and said, "Keith, I'm retiring. You're going to be the PI for the acquisition research program." So that's how I got started. But the whole purpose of the program was to increase the quality and quantity of scholarly research in acquisition by presenting it as an interesting area of research for scholars, both in universities and in other areas as well. So you can see some of the aspects of the early acquisition research program. One of the key participants during these early years was Jack Gansler. He was at University of Maryland by this time, so he was able to bring some of the University of Maryland faculty to bear in the early program. Some of the incentives that were present in this in these early years. Clearly, there were some funding opportunities there, mostly by individual Navy sponsors at the time. There was also the acquisition research program. I'm sorry, the acquisition research symposium. The first event was held in May of 2004, but this presented an opportunity for conference proceedings and outlook for publication, and also gave researchers the chance to sort of rub shoulders and mix it up with acquisition practitioners and policymakers, which created the opportunity for the potential for more funding for those researchers. And indeed, we began the repository of products, which continues today. During these early years, I think the contributions of Jack Gansler can't be overstated. He was continually preaching and promoting the need for acquisition research. And this is just one statement from Jack and Bill Decision about the importance of acquisition research to solve the specific problems that continue to face DoD acquisition. Turning to 2006, so through a variety of efforts, including those of Jack Gansler, we were able to have a decision by then Undersecretary Ken Krieg to sponsor a research program from OSD. We briefed him, Jim Green briefed him in 2006 in the Pentagon. This was a decision briefing that was attended by multiple AT&L staff at the time, as well as all of the service acquisition executives. Very interesting meeting to sit in on. After Jim Green had concluded his briefing, there was much discussion among the staff and the service acquisition executives. And one of the questions was asked, okay, so what are these researchers in this program going to work on? And Ken Krieg's response was, as you see there, I don't want to tell them what to work on. I want them to tell us what to do. And so the idea behind this program was not necessarily to incentivize university researchers to pursue new lines of research in defense acquisition, but rather to leverage their own existing lines of research and find ways to apply those to the problems of acquisition. And so any discipline that might be brought to bear on acquisition would be potentially considered here. Comment was also made, okay, they're just going to write tech reports and nobody read them, they'll just sit on a shelf. And Mr. Krieg again said, they can only do the research and tell us what the recommended solutions are. It's up to us to implement their recommendations if they're suitable. And I think this kind of gets to the whole issue of outcomes in policy types of research. The researchers really are not responsible for implementation. Certainly they can address the potential difficulties in implementation, but certainly ideas, recommendations have to be the purview of the decision makers. So just some additional details that you see there. The annual broad agency announcement, a very broad solicitation for research proposals, scored and rated by a committee of representatives from the different services. DAU had a representative as well. The 100K amount, and the 12-month period of performance was something of a risk reduction measure. And you see some of the initial awards that were made, some of the institutions that were that received the initial awards. So I want to turn now to a few slides that give some data on the OSD program. Here we see the number of awards to various institutions from 2007 to the present. I think a couple of things to note here. The top three institutions, NPS, Maryland, and CSIS. Certainly the number of awards to University of Maryland reflects the influence of Jack Gansler in bringing acquisition research to University of Maryland. It's interesting that I think, let's see here is three schools or three institutions have roughly half the awards, which reflects the priorities of those institutions. NPS clearly has a very strong acquisition curriculum in several areas, and lots of students, lots of faculty devoted specifically to defense acquisition. So the slides that follow give some data on the program during the years 2007 to 2013. Carrie Schaefer and I had published an analysis of some of these metrics. We did a systematic review of the research proposals received over these 7 years, basically using a content analysis to identify some patterns and themes. So let me just look at or show a couple of these slides to give you a sense of where acquisition research has been taking place. Here we see the frequency of proposals and awards by subject. I think something to note here is the large number of proposals and awards in just 4 subjects. Almost 60% of the proposals are in a third of these topics. Certainly contracting and logistics are recognized as traditional mainstream defense acquisition topics. I think the large number of proposals and awards in the category analysis and decision making and in cost, schedule, and performance may reflect both the researcher and the evaluator perceptions of the sort of perennially problematical outcomes in defense acquisition. Next, I will show some numbers on the type of research proposed during this time. The methodology and normative types really represent more practitioner-oriented research. Methodology would be essentially a how-to proposal, whereas normative would be research where there might be some citing of literature, but the point of the literature would be to support the opinions or the assertions of the author. So methodology and normative typically, again, representing practitioner-oriented research, while the other three typically associated more with scholarly research. I think this reflects a distinctly pragmatic bias towards defense acquisition research. The large number of proposals and awards in the methodology category shows some bias towards applied how-to research to solve some specific acquisition-related problem. And I think the high frequency of normative proposals reflects the definite ideas that the researchers have on the problem to be solved and how to solve it. More awards were made for these two categories. That perhaps suggests that the evaluators scoring these proposals prefer proposals that seem to offer definitive answers to problems, what should be done, how to do it, over those with more scholarly rigor that seek more foundational understandings. I think the infrequency of proposals in the hypothesis and literature categories would suggest a general lack of data in scholarly literature. Recognize that these data are 10 years old, but I expect that things are much the same today. So I would like to end with some more history. Over 100 years ago, facing the prevalence of probably graft, corruption, waste, fraud, and abuse in city governments, William Allen issued a call for 1,000 accountants for municipal research. And it's really coming out of the progressive era, the focus on reform, and really laying out the area of city government as a new frontier for accounting research. And so in the same way that he believed in the possibilities for accounting research in city government, we can also perhaps believe in the possibilities for reform, amelioration of acquisition, seemingly intractable problems through systematic investigations. Of course, he saw the skills of accountants as sufficient for that task, but we would have to call instead for a truly interdisciplinary mix of scholars that is suitable for the many facets of acquisition, technical, managerial, and political. And so perhaps we can look forward to the next century and imagine that our intellectual descendants would be able to study in a fully mature field of defense acquisition, and they will look back and commend us for our efforts. So let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Snider. Appreciate it. Next, we have Dr. Seraphin. He is a professional staff member on the Senate Armed Services Committee. His areas of responsibility include acquisition policy, Pentagon management systems, Department of Defense Science and Technology programs, information, let me get my video going here, there we go. Information technology systems, technology transition issues, defense laboratories, small business innovation research program, manufacturing programs, and tested evaluation programs. He's previously served as a principal assistant director for national security and international affairs at the White House Office of Science and Technology. He's also served on the United States House of Representatives Committee on Science Subcommittee on Research as a professional staff member. And he worked on the Science and Technology Division of the Institute of Defense Analysis. He's earned his PhD in electronics from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Dr. Seraphin, over to you.
Thanks, Admiral Lewis, and appreciate the opportunity to speak today. I always need to start with the disclaimer that nothing I say here represents the views of all of those former bosses or the current bosses at the Senate Armed Services Committee or future bosses. And some of what I say doesn't represent my views. This is just a forum to try out new ideas on an intelligent crowd and see what feedback I get. So I always appreciate that opportunity. I just wanted to talk about what we on the Hill at the staff level and with the department have been thinking about and talking about with respect to the need for a robust acquisition research portfolio out of the department, and want to leverage off what Dr. Snider was talking about all of the steps that have been taken and what's currently going on, especially at NPS through the acquisition research program, and say that, you know, this is the kind of thing that we want to leverage and grow from and use as the foundation for a bigger portfolio across the department. So I think the first thing I would say is that I think the department itself and the Congress, reflecting what it's hearing from the department and from constituents and industry, is more than ever realizing that there are legitimate management and acquisition problems facing the department that can be addressed by traditional research programs. And I think there's a couple of ways they think about that. One is when the department faces other challenges in the physical sciences, in the life sciences, it does naturally turn to a research community to develop new ideas to support the procurement of more mature ideas and to even address operational issues being faced in the field. So it's thinking about, the Navy would say, today's Navy, tomorrow's Navy, the Navy after next. And I think that on the Hill, we're sort of saying, okay, the department has acquisition challenges today and tomorrow and in the far future. So why wouldn't we position ourselves the same way as we think about the far future of hypersonics to think about the far future of acquisition in the world we're going to be operating in. Same parallel conversation is going on the management side, more broad than acquisition. You see the NDS talk about defense reform as a pillar of the national defense strategy that includes acquisition reform. The Senate Armed Services Committee, where I work, have had multiple hearings even this year on issues of acquisition and management in the Pentagon. So these issues are pressing in the members' minds, especially as more and more of them come from the private sector and see different ways of doing business, and often don't understand why the public sector, especially the Pentagon, is not using some of those private sector ways of doing business, even though they understand, and everyone understands, that no one business model works even between sectors on the commercial industry side. So they understand you can't just lift and replace a commercial sector model into the public sector, but they do also understand you can learn a lot from those people. And so I think there's this drive to better understand these problems and then go for things which may be solutions that are much more data-driven and maybe less gut-driven. Which is the way I think we observed a lot of acquisition changes being made over the years. So, these days, when we think about the need for an acquisition research program, I mean, we'd start by saying, here are some of the acquisition problems that we're seeing, and these are not new. This could have had this conversation in 1971, 1991, or 2021, and we'd probably be talking about the same things. Cost and schedule concerns. Issues with the PPB process, the way we move money to support acquisition, issues of risk aversion in a bureaucracy, either stifling innovation, slowing down the speed of innovation. More detailed issues like the growing need to understand better how best to write and manage service contracts, which are a growing proportion of the budget. The need to better understand how we should enter into IP negotiations with defense industry, with a growing set of companies in the commercial sector who want to do business with us. A need to understand how we develop, buy, and sustain software. A need to better understand our supply chain and the changing nature of our supply chain and the foreign influences on our supply chain. A need to understand how DoD is supposed to adapt and swim in a now global marketplace where lots of non-DoD money is changing our supply chain and changing the costs of things that DoD wants to buy. But DoD often is still reacting in a world where they were driving the technologies that they cared about. So, those are problems that exist. And like I said, in other areas where we have problems, DoD establishes research programs to try to develop and drive innovation, to try to develop new products and services for operational use. And so the Hill is a little bit taking up this charge, establishing things like blue ribbon commissions, the 809 panel, the 813 panel, seeking some expert advice in these problems. We've done legislation in the past, things like science and technology programs to support even the audit, to support operation of business systems, IT business systems, places where the science and technology community generally culturally doesn't usually play, but we think there is a role for them because of the challenges that the Department of Defense is facing. More recently, the R&E, at the behest of Congress, had a workshop on frontiers in information science and management science, looking at some possibility of translating the current problems of the Department of Defense into legitimate university questions, research questions. We've supported expansion of the Minerva program into management and information sciences and provided additional funding for the Minerva program. We've tried to push the Army Research Institute to look beyond looking at military leadership and training issues, but to look also at civilian leadership and training issues. All of these things aimed at looking at management questions, and the subset of that is acquisition questions, much more from a science and technology and research perspective. And then, of course, establishment of the Acquisition Innovation Research Center most recently, where we hope that this is a place building off of the good work at NPS to create that kind of multidisciplinary, multi-university community that can do everything ranging from basic research up to tech transition in this space of acquisition innovation. So when I think about what is it we want to see going forward in a robust research program, I think it would have a number of elements which we would find in any other discipline. Certainly, it has to have a strong element of basic research. Basic research, I guess, means, in my mind, publishable research, research that's funded at universities for faculty members and their students to work on and then publish, which is partially longer term and partially use inspired. And I think Dr. Snider talked about that spread of longer term research as opposed to sort of near term problem solving style research. And I think we'd like to see all of that. And those performers can come from schools like the traditional engineering schools that we usually fund, but I think these days, I think we should be looking more into those business schools, public administration schools, management schools. And I would say that the congressional staff on our visits to campuses, which we do routinely, now make it a point of not just stopping at the material science department, but also stopping at the business school and expressing some of the problems we are seeing in the same way we talk about some of the engineering problems we are seeing, and trying to talk to them about how they can work with the department to address some of these issues. So this engagement with the university community in a basic research mode that I think is a big element of this. And I want to point out, we're not looking for consulting. The department has no shortage of consultants, whether they're at FFRDCs or at private companies. I think we're really looking for a research community as opposed to a consulting community. And I think one of the benefits of a real research community is that, unlike a consulting community, it creates a pipeline of talent, which we depend on in the physical sciences and the life sciences. But I don't think we've stimulated that same pipeline of talent into the Pentagon coming from the business schools, the management schools, the public administration schools that we have in those other disciplines. And I think a research program, an extramural research program like this would help stimulate that. I think another element of this is the applied research, the more use-inspired research that's working with those policymakers, working with those program offices that have run into acquisition issues, and then turning those into the use-inspired research questions that the university community or the small business community could help address. And so, that's the equivalent of 6-2, I think, acquisition research that we'd like to see. A good research portfolio should have a strong in-house capability for the Department of Defense. In the physical sciences side, we see that at the labs and the test ranges. Where is that in the department's network of labs and ranges? I guess it's over in places like NPS and in the war colleges. And so we need to make sure we have a strong, robust in-house research capability. And I think more important, because we do have a research capability, is a testing capability. I think one of the things that we find funny in the acquisition world is the limited ability to test out new acquisition ideas. So where is our acquisition test range? Along with that is this idea of UARCs, right? And I think Eric is an example of an attempt to sort of creep into the world of UARCs. In other disciplines that we care about, nanotechnology, biotechnology, we established these university affiliated research centers, either at one school or multiple schools. Do we have the equivalent thing? Well, we're trying now, I think, in the ERIC concept. And UARCs have served the department well. And I think in this area where the department has so many challenges, maybe a UARC model might work as well. And I think there should be a strong modeling and simulation component to this. It's similar to the testing question. You know, the joke we have on the Hill is that if you want to deploy new body armor, you can model it to death using the fanciest supercomputer that Sandia National Laboratory has to offer, and then take it out to Aberdeen and shoot at it. On the other hand, if you want to write an NDAA provision to change the law, the DFARS, and the way that thousands of businesses handle, and the Pentagon handles millions of dollars, there is no testing or modeling simulation capability available for you. So you can just fire away right away. So, you know, where do we have and how can we establish this kind of modeling and simulation capability? And then, of course, and maybe this is the hardest piece, is that any good research program has a robust system of transitioning research ideas into acquisition, into operational use. And so that means we need a place to do prototypes, places like the DARPAs of the world, who can do project-based prototyping, work closely with the customers on the receiving end in the services or in the policy shops in this case. And then if those prototypes work, put them into operational use. And if the operational use makes sense, disseminate that operational use across the whole department. So, you know, we've tried this in other places. DARPA prototyped the use of other transactions. Now other transactions have spread across the department. DARPA has prototyped in the service labs, for example, have prototyped some clever personnel hiring authorities. Those have then worked in the small scale and have been disseminated across the department. Prize Authority, again, started at DARPA as a prototype, worked, now it's being used across the government. So can we do more of this kind of acquisition policy prototyping? You know, I hope we can. And so is transition going to be hard? Yes. But is transition hard in every discipline? Yes. So, okay, I don't care that maybe everything doesn't transition. That's not the standard we hold to the rest of science and technology too. You know, we go after transition failures. We try to address the valley of death. I fully expect there will be a valley of death for great acquisition innovation ideas, but I also expect that many good ideas will actually transition into operational use, like some of the examples I just cited. So, you know, underlying all of these things, I think, are some common themes. One is people. You know, one concept we need to think about is the education part of this. And so, you know, we point out that training at DAU or wherever is not the same thing as executive education and sending general officers to Harvard Business School or Darden. And that's also not the same thing as education. And we all know those are three different things. And I think working with the academic community to establish the real educational pipeline is another element of establishing this sort of acquisition innovation ecosystem that we want. I think the other element of the people is what I touched on before, is that the research community that we establish will create that pipeline of people, those student interns that come and work at DPC, or work at contracting commands, those folks at contracting commands who can go and teach at these kinds of schools, which naturally happens at the Naval Research Lab or the Air Force Research Lab, but doesn't quite happen as much with the business and management schools and their parallels in the Pentagon. And I think the other thing that I would love to copy from the S&T community is the robust use of IPAs. DARPA, National Science Foundation, ONR, are filled with IPAs from university communities, working for short periods of time at the appropriate time in their careers and doing good public service as program managers or serving in offices. Can we create that same kind of IPA rotator system in these kinds of acquisition and management functions? So that people element, I think, is helped through this establishment of this acquisition research community. The second thing is infrastructure. And, this community doesn't need wind tunnels, but it does need a different kind of infrastructure, I would argue. It needs data, and it needs a place for that data to be shared and appropriately sorted so only the right people can see the right kind of data, whether we're talking about proprietary data or classified data or other controlled data. We need to establish those systems by which that data is shared. When we visit campuses, just to highlight again what Dr. Snider said, usually what we hear is, we'd love to do this research with you as long as it's interesting and good research that my students can work on, and you give me data so I have a prayer of actually doing the research. And so that data piece becomes very difficult. And at least from the congressional perspective, it's funny to me that it's almost easier for us to provide threat data and data about the systems we want to produce for this university research community than it is for the department to provide data about their own acquisition failures or their own management failures, even though they're probably sitting on more data there. And I wonder if that's more of a cultural problem and reluctance to share that kind of acquisition data than it is to share the physical sciences and engineering data that the university community is already living off of. The other part of the infrastructure, I think, is things like the conferences like this one, like the journals where people can publish this kind of work, and those forums where people can get together and feel that they have the community. And so how do we establish this equivalent infrastructure in this acquisition research community, I think is an important question. And then most important, and I understand this, I work for Congress, is funding. So the Department of Defense's budget is immensely huge, $750 billion in discretionary spending, $1 billion total each year. The research budget in S&T is 16 billion or so, and R&D budget is 70 billion. And I assert that in all of that, we can find some money to do acquisition research, especially given that the acquisition research can actually help us spend all of that money better. So I would assert that we could look at places like the Small Business Innovation Research Program for potentially some topics in acquisition research, maybe in things like data analytics. We could look at some of the funding that's going to consulting at the FFRDCs and turn those into research funding programs. We could look at some of the basic research offices and ask them to slice off small pieces of their research budgets to look at these disciplines in the same way that they're growing their portfolios in places like the social sciences. And then, of course, there's the traditional sources like the Acquisition Workforce Development Account that are already authorized to do these kinds of research activities. So with that, I'll stop, and I'm happy to take questions, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
All right, thank you, Dr. Seraphin. That was excellent. We have questions coming in, so I'm banking them. Last and certainly not least, we have Dr. Verma, professor and executive director of SERC and of ERIC. He's the founding dean of the School of Systems Enterprises at Stevens Institute Technology from 2007 through 2016. He served as a scientific advisor to the director of the Embedded Systems Institute in Eindhoven, Holland from 2003 to 2008. I thought that was kind of cool. Technical director at Lockheed Martin Undersea Systems in Manassas. A lot going on when he was there. He's been a research scientist at Virginia Tech and managed the university's Systems Engineering Design Laboratory. He's received 3 patents in the areas of life cycle costing and fuzzy logic techniques. I didn't know you could get a patent in life cycle costing. So thank you very much, Dr. Verma, for agreeing to speak with us today, and over to you. I think you're muted. Still muted. There we go. I think you're off now.
Thank you, Admiral Lewis. I appreciate that. I'll just say that I appreciate the ordering of the speakers. It was really good to hear Dean Snider, and it was really good to hear Dr. Seraphin. It's good for me to build upon the mental model that they've conveyed as part of this panel. And what I'll do is, instead of getting into the formal language, which I'll certainly make reference to in my briefing that motivated the establishment of ERIC, let me begin with perhaps sharing with you in my role as Dr. Seraphin said, that this is an experiment to see if we can develop an S&T-like enterprise to focus on the business aspects of the acquisition system. Let me share with you what I believe I've heard from some of the critical stakeholders. And many of those, if not all of those critical stakeholders, have been part of this symposium this week. And so let me give you my perspective on what I've been hearing senior executives, certainly executives that I deal with on a weekly basis, even tell me. They tell me that they would want ERIC to become a platform for the generation of a diversity of ideas and inputs, such that we're able to truly leverage the intent in the language that Dr. Seraphin alluded to, and where appropriate, request waivers in support of experiments and pilots that result from this research. To Arun's point about looking beyond engineering and science, I believe what we have to also do is look at the cultural, the organizational, the business aspects. And in some cases, I think one of the takeaways that I had from Dean Snider's briefing was that language matters. The way we articulate our desire for research matters, particularly as we look at academia. And often within academia, we tend to think of it as a homogeneous ecosystem, as some of us who have lived in academia for decades realize, the culture in a school of engineering is quite different from the culture in a school of business or in a law school or in a public policy or a public administration school. And so it is our role, I believe, to think about ways in which we can cross those cultural boundaries as we look to engage academia in a broad way. Now, you will look at some of these items here when I talk about the congressional and legislative perspectives, and you'll recognize them immediately given Dr. Seraphin's remarks from earlier in the panel. This is the way I have internalized it. In my mind, my mental model is that ERIC needs to be focused on seminal research that translates into high impact journal publications, and yet it needs to be mission focused. In other words, ERIC has to become a platform to connect the users and the operators with the researchers. And that's a tall order because incentive structures are different within those two communities. The research portfolio that we put in place within ERIC has to deal with basic research and applied research. In other words, we have to go for some high impact and high risk ideas as well. The thing that I keep talking to our faculty members across the 20+ universities within ERIC and SERC is that we have to go beyond white papers and recommendations. We have to think about our research and our hypotheses such that they lend themselves to translation into instrumented pilots, experiments, and certainly modeling and simulation efforts. Arun talked about the need for a test range for policies and practices. Professor Bill Rouse at Georgetown calls it a policy flight simulator. And there is existence proof of this. We have developed this in a couple of domains, and there is quite a bit of excitement within academia to try and do this within a system with the scale and the complexity of the DoD acquisition system. Certainly, in order to do this, we have to look beyond engineering and science to business schools, policy schools, law schools. And as Arun said, ERIC, if done right, if we have the impact that is intended, it becomes a mechanism to enhance the current workforce while also developing a pipeline of talent for the DoD going forward. So that's the perspective I've had internalized from these 2 points of view. Let me also share with you perspectives from the military departments. And of course, some of these came from the forum we held about a month or so ago, again in a virtual format. The idea that we have to close the gap between science and technology and acquisition. Given the urgencies of today, we've got to focus on not just digital engineering, but also agile development and application of modular open systems architectures. We have to focus on how do we upskill today's and tomorrow's acquisition professionals. And sometimes I have to say that we use certain phrases in a way that makes them feel seductively simple. We call it the acquisition system. It's a neat phrase. We call them acquisition professionals, and it's a neat, simple phrase. But what it hides is the diversity of functions and capabilities that need to come together in order for us to have the aspirational acquisition system that we are in the process of pursuing. And so when you peel the onion, there is a tremendous amount of diversity that we have to address. And as a researcher, one of my concerns is not to boil the ocean, but to find these targets of opportunities where we in fact have the possibility of making a dent. And so when we, for example, or when I hear sponsors talk about the need for digital engineering, going hand in hand with that is enhanced research and model verification validation. As we talk about agile development and DevOps and DevSecOps, the input we're receiving is we need new cost models to estimate, as Arun also alluded to these service contracts. We have to rethink some of these different dimensions all at the same time because they're so connected to each other. The acquisition process, the engineering process, the requirements process. And of course, it's amazing how many meetings I've gone to in the last 3 months where so often this notion of intellectual property comes up and that we've got to figure out a graceful way out of it. Now, of course, there's a lot of people who've been thinking about the acquisition system in the FFRDC community and then the think tank community. And so from some perspectives from here, that there is a significant skills gap. So this notion of workforce development and not only today, going into the future, and the need to invest in developing talent for the future, this is a pattern that keeps repeating itself in what we are hearing when we talk to our various stakeholders. Now, a little bit of history. Many of you on this panel know about the SERC, but for those that don't, just 30 seconds on it. SERC is a UARC. It was established through a competitive process in 2008. It's a little bit unique compared to some of the other UARCs in that this is the only UARC that is funded at the DoD level. It reports into OUSD R&E, and it truly is a network of 20+ universities that include NPS and AFIT within this network. In some ways, it goes beyond technology domains and focuses on the discipline of systems engineering and more recently, government acquisition, where systems engineering is a subset. This is what the formal language calls us to do, to provide academic analyses, do research that translates into demonstrations and pilot programs where we're able to test out innovative ideas relating to acquisition policies and practices. And then can we make this decision-making process more evidence-based, data-based, rather than gut-based, like Arun alluded to. The idea is for us to create or nucleate a research community focused on this broad aspect of DoD acquisition. The charter says that ERIC will do research, obviously, but the charter also says that it has to translate that research into prototypes and demonstrate new acquisition practices and policies rather than just write white papers around them, so that we can actually learn from them, gain insights, and where appropriate, scale beyond the notion of what a research experiment might be. But in order to do that, we need to have access to data repositories so that we can actually create that analytical capability in support of the DoD mission. We have to also think about how our research directly and indirectly translates into the impact we have on the acquisition workforce. And where appropriate, we expect our sponsors to call upon us for thoughts and ideas with regard to recommended implementations, policies, and practices. Now, with that in mind, and again, just so everybody has a sense for the timeline, ERIC was established on the 30th of September last year. So we're about 6-7 months into this process of getting established. There are two broad bodies that guide us. First, of course, we have, if you look towards the left, the AIA. These are all the leaders within the Pentagon, the DoD, and beyond across the components. They are essentially our sponsors. They're the ones who own the problems, they own the mission, they own the charter. And then on the right, we've established some external thinkers. It's a combination of faculty members and individuals that have a leadership perspective from having been within the department in different capacities, different roles, and academia. And so we're looking for a diverse set of ideas that the intent is to nucleate ideas, share them with the AIA membership, and where appropriate, translate them into research projects in the form of hypotheses and see if you can get engagement from the university. So you see those at the bottom where we have reach across the 20+ universities and of course, all the different schools within this network of universities. It is my role to make sure that I leverage to the maximum extent possible the faculty members that reside across the 20+ universities that make up the SERC and ERIC. It is obvious to me, certainly when you look at the complexity of the DoD acquisition system, that our success will depend on our ability to engage across the extended acquisition community. All the way from policy, requirements and intelligence, funding, programs, tests, contracting, and of course, industry at all scales, the large companies, the small companies, and of course, companies that are in the commercial sector, as Arun alluded to also, where we can learn from what they're doing, not only in terms of technology, but more importantly, in terms of the business models they use and the way they approach their supply chains and resilience thereof. And so one of the objectives we have is to really think about this extended acquisition community and put in place mechanisms that allow us to robustly engage across. I would tell you that I've never felt the constraints resulting from COVID-19 more than I have in the last 5 or 6 months. And so while so much can be done, as we're doing this week as part of the symposium, I can't wait for us to get to a point of greater normalcy where we can truly engage robustly in live gatherings and get-togethers, so we can actually create a marketplace of ideas that resonate and are found interesting by our colleagues within academia as well. This perspective is for me to convey to you the idea that we're looking at different pathways for engaging via the SERC and ERIC. In the interest of time, what I will do is focus on the pathway that you see on the top left, the incubate pathway. Realize, of course, that ERIC will respond, if you look at the bottom left, to requests for tasks that come to us from the sponsors. A critical task we're working on with our sponsors within ANS and is around the whole area of data strategy to enhance our acquisition outcomes. And so while we respond to priorities from within the DoD, in the last 3 or 4 months, a lot of our focus and energy has been on how do we incubate new ideas around some priority themes. And again, the key here is to connect basic and applied research that translates into high impact journals with missions. So you have a lot of research that is not mission focused. And as Arun said, you have a lot of consulting that is mission focused. We're trying to see how can we combine high impact research that is focused on high priority missions within the DoD. And part of that was for us to experiment with this notion of incubate. The idea being that, can we talk to the broad community, come up with certain ideas that are our sponsors within the DoD consider to be relevant and well aligned with today's priorities. And then let's see if academia has ideas on how they would address them. And we're using a model where we have phase 1, where they nucleate that idea, develop that idea further, perhaps think about how they might experiment with it, apply modeling and simulation to it, gain insights from it, And that might perhaps flow into a phase 2 research project, which is over a longer period of time. And so this is the notion that we've been working on over the last 3 months or so. And this is a cadence we've been on. And I can't thank my sponsors within ANS enough for supporting us with this. This is warp speed from an academic point of view. So just so you have a sense, we got established essentially on October 1st. In December, we had meetings with the AIA, our sponsors within the DoD. We set up the Acquisition Innovation Advisors in January. And then, as you see, we've been keeping to this cadence. Tomorrow is our deadline to receive proposals in response to our call for proposals. We expect anywhere between 25 and 100 proposals to come in that we will then go through and make our recommendations to our sponsors. But this is an experiment to see if we can in fact link academic research with areas of priority within the DoD. And again, in order to give some structure to the incubate cycle for 2021, we decided that we will think of this as a theme for this year, digital transformation and acquisition. It's broad enough anyhow, but we wanted to have some way to provide some guardrails for some of these ideas that would come to us. And then we went beyond just looking at this broad area of digital transformation and acquisition. And these are the 5 areas. Some of you are who've looked at the call for research proposals know these rather well. So this topic came up even in the Q&A for this panel. A lot of focus and a lot of interest in how do you upskill the existing acquisition workforce. And so there are some ideas that we are generating in that space. This notion of how you really need to have corporate memory so that when a particular leader is making decisions on a program, they have some context for decisions that were made perhaps 3, 4, 5 years ago. And how can they keep options open for leaders that come after them? Arun alluded to this notion of a culture that looks at risk averseness as they're looking at decisions. How do we align incentives to encourage agility and innovation within the DoD acquisition ecosystem? And then, of course, as more and more software becomes ubiquitous, how do we develop models for perhaps test and evaluation as systems become, have increasing levels of cognition built within them? And then also looking at perhaps innovative ways to look at the return on investment through investments made in the digital infrastructure and how it might support decision-making and better resource allocation within the department. I would say to you that it gives you a sense for what we've been up to for the last 4 or 5 months or so. I wanted to conclude by saying that Dr. Peter Levine was part of this symposium a couple of days ago as part of a panel that Admiral Lewis ran. I'm not going to go through all his 10 points, but he wrote a paper in 2019 that I've taken to heart. And I love this paper because it could only have been written by somebody who's been there and done that. It reflects to me a sense of wisdom and insight that as an academic, I find reassuring. And so I've actually used this slide many times with faculty members to show, think of this as a way for us to remain grounded as we look at this wicked system, the DoD acquisition system, and do research, not just for research sake, but also so we can actually perhaps add value that is so desperately needed, as this panel is alluding to and as this conference is alluding to. I'll stop and look forward to discussions later on.
Thank you, Dr. Verma. That was excellent. There are more questions being asked than we could possibly cover in the time allowed. So I picked out 1 or 2, and with the time we have left, we might get through those 2. So the first one is for you, Arun, from Raymond Jones, one of our faculty here at NPS. Your comments on acquisition simulation range are similar to warfighting ranges that drive critical thinking, inform doctrine, and drive future research. In order to develop integrated ranges that include both warfighting and doctrine and acquisition, what are your thoughts on how to change the culture in the operational community that acquisition can be a force multiplier that should be integrated into operational planning and not simply viewed as a business? What happened there? As a, oops, I lost it. There it is. As a
As an annoying back
business.
office business function, I
There
think
you
is,
go.
yeah, okay. I mean, I think one thing is we've pushed on the notion of cross-functional teams and revisiting the idea of alpha contracting and maybe engaging the operational community more in the acquisition process. I think the software people are kind of also leading the way in this, and that they're showing the operational community that if they pay attention earlier, they'll get the capabilities they want faster and arguably cheaper, though they may not actually care that much about the cheapness. They also will end up with capabilities that are much more sustainable. And so I think that engagement, I think, is one piece. The other thing I would love to see from a congressional perspective is that in the war games that we are briefed on, that 4 stars come and brief my bosses about, there is an assumption that in the year 2027, these platforms will be ready to go and they'll shoot missiles in the Pacific at someone and things like that. Those are all based on the idea that the acquisition programs actually delivered on time. And so I wish one of these war games would say, it turns out our delivery rate is only this. So here's what we actually have in 2027, and we lose. But the war games always seem to have this optimistic view of the acquisition community. So I think, if I could get, and those things are driven by the operational community. So if I could get them to admit that the acquisition community can only deliver so much, and they're an important thing that everyone should be paying attention to in those war games that they're using to justify their force structure requests and their budget requests, I think that would help the situation as well.
Okay, excellent answer. Yeah, I've advocated for the same thing. Maybe we can get that moving. One more question. This is from Bob Mortlock, one of our faculty here. Let me see if I can get to the meat of it. How can we get increased interest in making graduate education and acquisition sciences available to more civilians in the acquisition workforce? In the long run, this may have a highest ROI to fix the annual challenges seen in programs meeting cost, schedule, and performance requirements. That's open to any panelists.
I'll just start and say, getting the word out is one thing. I mean, we've got, and I know there are excellent programs at other universities, but certainly here at the Naval Postgraduate School, we have some really on point and tailored educational programs, graduate education programs for DoD civilians. And so, for those who are interested, I would, just say, okay, let's figure out a way to get the word out more broadly to the acquisition workforce for the education opportunities that present themselves. I would also say that, we need to make education opportunities available at other universities as well. Affordable, flexible programs. While we've got programs here at NPS, we can't handle all of the education needs for the DoD. And so figure out a way to make those opportunities known to the workforce more broadly.
Thank you. So I'll close. We have 2 minutes. So I'll close with the elephant in the room. We've got several questions on this. I'll just kind of bundle them together. And this is for you, Dr. Verma. Data. How are we going to get, how is the department, who is, as you noted, famously closed book when it comes to acquisition data, performance data, CPARS data, EVMS data, contract data, financial data? How is the department going to make that data more available than it is today? And just to put a stinger on that, Naval Postgraduate School, federal institution, federal employees can't get the data. So if we can't get the data, how is University of where, North, whatever, going to get the data? Over.
So Admiral Lewis, I'll begin by saying that within academia, if you're doing research in a multidisciplinary domain, you cannot survive unless you're a pathological optimist. That's a going-in condition.
Okay,
because
I'll accept that.
it goes against the grain of academia to be broad-based and multidisciplinary, because our promotion and tenure, criteria cause us to become deeper and narrower and so on and so forth. So I just say that as an aside to say that I'm coming in as an optimist, and with that in mind, I look at this as a two-step process, and I've got this caveat that I don't want to mention names outside of my friends on the panel because it wouldn't be fair. But the first step we are taking within ERIC is to create a portal where we are going to list links from where data is currently available already that academia may not be familiar with. Sometimes they are in niche areas that, unless you're working in a certain aspect of the acquisition system, you may not even be aware that a certain amount of data is available, and a typical faculty member may not be aware of it. So one thing we want to do immediately is create a view for faculty about where is the data currently available, albeit suboptimal, but it is available. And if you can create a channel where we can create those links for everybody, at least we reduce the transaction cost that an individual faculty member or appropriate students might want to go and look at that data. And while we do that, comes the second topic. Again, not mentioning names, but there is a tremendous amount of interest. And one aspect of this data strategy task that we are working on is to create a portal for data. This is going to be hard. It's not going to be easy. If it was easy, it would have been done already. But to create a portal where we can do this once and at least begin not with a 0-1 answer, but at least some progress along the spectrum to where faculty members don't have to go through that effort. Faculty members, they don't know what a CAC card is, much less have one. And so I'm not giving you an answer that is a perfect answer. I'm giving you an answer that seems like the most reasonable approach for us. So we at least have something to show for it, 3 months, 6 months down the road. Because I don't want to be complaining all the time. I want us to make some progress where we can point to where faculty members can go and have access to at least some data. Hopefully that.
Okay. Well, that's we're actually a little over time. There is a coffee break scheduled where we can continue this discussion. I invite all the panelists to go. It's an open session for other registered participants, and you can have a more interactive discussion if you have time for that. But again, I thank you all for participating this morning. Those in California that got up early, thank you. And again, I think this has been a significant contribution to the discussion and to the field of acquisition research. So I very much appreciate your time and preparation and presentation. And thank you all, and happy Thursday. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.